can get started. So first of all, just let me share my screen. So if during this presentation you have any questions or anything, you can just type them in the chat, or you can use the Teams raise my hand feature, and then we can actually give you a turn to open your mic and do your question that way if you prefer that. And if you have any issues hearing me or seeing what I'm presenting, then please do tell me before I've done that for like the last 15 minutes. So okay, I think we can get started. So today's topic is going to be about UI testing, about running automated UI tests on an application. Specifically, we're interested in a single page application that's using Azure AD authentication. And we're going to be using a library or tool called Cypress to do these tests, though a similar approach can be applied to other UI testing frameworks as well. So first, a little introduction about Finland Azure User Group, if this is your first time in one of these meetings. So this user group was founded in 2013 to spread information about Microsoft Azure and cloud computing in general. So we now have over 1,600 members, and we organize quite a lot of events yearly. Not so much in person right now, of course, as we would have like last year. We have a big conference called IgluConf that we organize once a year. And now this virtual Azure Tips and Tricks series that this presentation is a part of is kind of short tips and tricks for you on some small limited topics. So if you want to actually know when the next meetup event is going to happen, I recommend you join the meetup group for FAUG. And on YouTube, you can find all of the recordings, as you will be able to find the recording for this presentation as well. And the next presentation is actually going to be a couple of weeks later. It's going to be on the week that starts on the 12th of October by Oskari Heikkinen. The exact date, time, and topic are not yet known, but they will be published soon. Okay, Pasi, do you have anything to add to this one?
Basically just that Finland Azure User Group is always looking for more presenters. So if you yes. Want to speak at these events, feel free to contact me on Twitter. And I'll just post my nick here, so there you can message me if you want to speak.
All right. Thanks, Pasi. So a small introduction about me. My name is Joonas Westlin. I work as a developer/architect at Azure. We do a lot of Azure software, as you might know from the company name. I do a lot of stuff related to Azure and especially Azure AD. I'm very active on Stack Overflow, for example. So if you ever ask a question there related to Azure AD, there's a really, really high chance that I've at least seen it. And so I'm one of the Azure MVPs in Finland, and there's also my Twitter handle, and as well as the address for my blog, if you're interested. I'm going to be writing up an article related to this presentation at some point in the future as well. But enough about me. So first of all, I want to just introduce to you what is UI testing and what I mean by it in this context. So Cypress has a really nice video on their website that shows you kind of an example of Cypress in action. So I thought I'd show you a quick slice of that so you understand what we're going to be doing. Okay, so I think that's basically enough. So Cypress allows you to write this kind of automated tests for a user interface for a web application, where in those tests that you write with JavaScript, you can test for presence of certain elements, for certain content. You can click buttons. You can change the view size to test that the UI scales correctly, for example. You can do lots and lots of different things. And the test runner of Cypress is very nice that you see here. Actually, it shows you all the steps that it's doing in the tests and allows you to inspect the DOM at different times. So you can see kind of how it changed during the tests. And for example, if the test failed, you can figure out why that happened quite nicely. So now in this presentation, we're talking about Azure AD protected single page applications and testing of those using Cypress. So a single page application that's protected by Azure AD usually it uses the MSL.js library to talk with Azure AD to authenticate the user and so on. You can actually use other libraries as well, but MSL.js is the kind of the typical one. So by using this library, the application running in the browser is able to acquire access tokens that it can then use to call APIs that are also protected by Azure AD. Now, one approach that you could take when you write an automated UI test would be to automate the login page itself. So, just enter the username and password there through Cypress. And well, it's a very bad idea. I wouldn't recommend doing that. First of all, because the product team for Azure AD has told me so on multiple occasions that it's a really, really bad idea. It can break stuff very easily. Your tests will break. I can also say that there's been a couple cases where I've seen this being done, and they've had to fix their tests multiple times because Azure AD login just changed, and they might also just decide to block you because they consider you a bot, and they might just block you entirely. So that's a pretty bad idea. So we can do that better. We can use an authentication flow called ROPC to get the tokens. And then we can actually inject these tokens into local or session storage in the browser in the format that's expected by MSL.js. And then we run our UI tests. Now, I typically tend to tell people to avoid the ROPC flow, mainly because it's abused to make custom login forms and stuff like that. But in this case, it actually kind of makes sense. We do want to do a non-interactive authentication, but for the user that we have. So when we run the Cypress process, what we want to happen is that we want to actually acquire tokens with the ROPC flow from Azure AD using an HTTP request. And then once we've done that, we want to inject those tokens into the browser and then start running commands on the UI. And then the UI app is able to call our API, which is also running with actual access tokens. So the idea here is that we kind of fool MSL.js into thinking that it has already acquired the tokens and it doesn't have to do anything. So it already has tokens in cache, so it's not going to try to, acquire tokens through any other flow. So let's get to the demo. So the presentation, like the PowerPoint part of the presentation is actually kind of over now. I tried to keep the amount of slides pretty low this time around. So let me actually first show you what the application looks like. So the full source code for this application is going to be available on GitHub. And it actually already is in my GitHub. So it's a fairly simple application. So I've just taken the ASP.NET Core React single page app template, and I've just added authentication to it. And that's all I've done. So if you're not authenticated, it shows you this like sign in button. So if we click that, we go to Azure AD to authenticate. I'm already signed in. And I click on that, and we are now logged in. And in this app, there's this simple counter, which we don't really care about. But the interesting part is this weather forecast here. So this one is actually going to be calling our backend. So if I actually go back and forth here, you can actually see how it's calling our backend API here. And along with that request, we are passing an authorization header. So this includes that access token that the single page app has acquired, right? Okay, so now in order to actually inject those tokens into local storage here, we do need to figure out what kind of format is MSAL.js expecting here. And that took quite some research and also figuring out, MSAL.js source code and kind of reverse engineering it from there to figure out what it actually does. So, for example, we can find the ID token for the user that just tells your app kind of the user's name and so on. So that's stored like that. Then we can find this is just account information. This one, I think. And here we have a refresh token, actually. So now actually I do need to point out that we are using MSAL.js 2.0 in this app, not 1.x. So this is using the authorization code flow for authentication, which includes refresh tokens. And we also have the important access token. So from here, we are able to actually figure out, okay, what is the format that this really expects, right? So let's go ahead and start building some Cypress tests to test this app, actually. So this is a quite empty application at the moment. There really isn't much there. So I'm just going to initialize a new NPM project there. And I'm actually just going to accept defaults for everything. So we get a default package.json there. And then what I just want to install a couple packages. I want Cypress, and I'm actually going to install a specific version of Cypress right now. The only reason I'm doing that is because installing Cypress for the first time, if it's a new version, it takes around a minute, and I don't really want to wait for that. So I prefer to use a version that I already have in cache. So even that version takes a while. Okay, so it found the Cypress version there in cache. And another library that we're going to install is called JSON Web Token. And the JSON Web Token library allows us to process the tokens, mainly the ID token returned by Azure AD, so that we are able to find out, for example, the user's username from there, because we do need to enter that into one of the local storage items. Okay, so now we have both of the libraries there. Now we are going to run we're going to actually run Cypress. In order to run Cypress a little bit easier, I'm going to actually add a script in here. This is actually one of the recommended approaches from the Cypress documentation. So you just add like the Cypress open, or you can call it whatever you want. And then I can actually run it in here in Visual Studio Code, just from here on the left. So we're just going to test that this all works. Okay, seems like it is taking a moment to start this time. So actually on the first run, if I remember correctly, it's going to be adding a bunch of default stuff into the project, which you see now. So Cypress has added the Cypress folder as well as the Cypress JSON configuration file into our project. And it has added these like example tests that you can actually use to figure out how to do different kinds of things with Cypress. For example, if you want to see how to do some things with local storage, you can just check out that test. And also, if you want to actually just run a test, we just click on that. And it opens the test in Chrome in this case. You can select which browser to use on that page we were earlier. So this is just one of the Cypress kind of example tests that it has. Okay, for some reason it decided to reload. Not sure why, but okay. Now it's run. And you can kind of see an example of what Cypress does. So you can so before each test, it loads up a page. Then it is going to be finding this button, which you can see on the right. It's getting highlighted. It's clicking on that. You can actually see what coordinate it clicked, and then there's some assertions. Then it's clearing local storage, and then doing some more assertions, and so on. So we can actually close that. And you can see from here the kind of browser selection that I was talking about. So you can run your tests on Firefox or Edge or whatever's installed on your machine. Okay, but let's just close Cypress for now. Because actually, so now we've got all of these examples here, and we don't really need those right now. So I'm just going to delete the examples folder. And instead, I'm going to add a file where we will test the data fetching page that we have in our application, so the weather forecast page. Now, in order to actually write this properly and get some proper code completion in VS Code, I do need to add this kind of type reference at the top. So the point here is that Cypress exposes all of these like testing functions as kind of global functions. So we do need to just tell Visual Studio Code that, yeah, it's okay, the global types from this module are available at this point. So we use the context function here to specify a set of tests. And before each of the tests, we want to actually open the root page. Okay, let's do it. And then each of those tests you defined with this it function. So you give the test some name, for example, that it shows a table. We want to check for that. Now, actually, how do we check for a table? So you could use something like CSS selectors to find it. But I'll actually show you how that looks like, the JavaScript for that page. So there we have our table. So we could look for it based on we could find it like, find a table with the class table, for example, or something like that. But the problem with that is that that's you're really tying your test to your DOM structure at the time, and it just makes it really, really fragile. So what actually Cypress recommends in their documentation is that you use these data attributes to give it some kind of identifier. So then no matter where it is on the page, how the structure is of the layout, it can still locate it no matter what. So it's a bit more robust, I guess. So we have that attribute, so we can find the table using that. We've also added that same attribute here on the row, because we do want to test something on these rows as well. Yeah, so that is how we're going to find it. And actually, let's actually do this. So let's actually go to the fetch data page, and we are going to actually try to get the element on the page where the data CY attribute equals forecast dash table, right? And then we can do a test on it, an assertion. And this is the point where I'm really thankful for the autocomplete, because this is like just a string. So the forecast table should be visible. Looks about right. Now some of you might already kind of figure out that this might not actually work, but let's just see what happens. So we've actually asked it to load up that one. And we can see the page loading there. And well, it's trying to find that table, but it's not finding it. And we can kind of see why on the right side. So yeah, it's not logged in, right? But yeah, so for some of you, the instinct might then be like, okay, I need to just automate the click and then automate the username and password entry. But we have a better way of doing that. We don't need to do that. So actually, what we want to do is create a support module for authentication. So we're going to create a module that's going to handle authentication in the tests for us. Now, in order to actually run it, we do need some settings for it as well. So this includes, for example, the client ID of the application, a client secret, a username and password, and a couple other things. So we're just going to call this one auth settings.json. And I'm going to copy over some sample content for it. So this is the sample content where I do have to actually replace the actual content. So the authorities should include your Azure AD tenant ID, and this should be the application client ID. Then here's the client secret for the app. Then there should be some scopes. So what scopes do you want to acquire the token for? As well as a username and password. Now, the user that you make for this, and yes, this should be a user that you actually create specifically for this purpose, should be one that actually doesn't have multi-factor authentication, because this ROPC flow doesn't work if the user has MFA. It also doesn't really work if they're a guest user. So this really has to be a user that you create in that tenant. And now because of this, that you're actually putting a password and using it here, I would highly recommend that you don't do this in your production tenant, because that's a pretty bad idea. And also adding like git ignores for this file so that it's not actually checked into the repository is a pretty good idea as well. Now, because I don't really want to share my credentials with you, not that I don't trust you or anything, but I'm going to actually add the actual contents of the file off screen. And then I'm going to close the file. So the actual content is there. You just kind of have to believe me that it's there. Now, in this Auth.js, we do need to use those Cypress types as well. So I'm going to copy that over here. In addition, we need to import those auth settings from that auth settings JSON. And I'm just going to do a small deconstruction for that here to make it a little bit easier for us. Autocomplete, grab all of them. So now we have almost all of those values that we need. There's one more value that we actually do need in those values, and that's the environment. If we actually go to look at the app, and we look at the content that is in local storage, you will find that there's this environment property in all of them. And in my case, at least with all of my users that I've tried, it's always login.windows.net. Now, this might be different in some cases, but at least in the cases that I've seen, it's always been that. So we're going to use that one. Okay, so what we actually do need to do is we need to export a function. We're just going to call it login. So this is the function that we're going to use in our tests to actually ensure that the user is authenticated before we run the tests. So yeah, it's a function. And it's going to call the Cypress object. Well, first of all, we need to visit the root. Because in order to actually inject local storage items, you do need to have already loaded a page because the local storage is specific to that page, to that origin. But now, one thing that we could actually do at this point is that we can actually move this one to the Cypress JSON. So the Cypress JSON allows us to actually specify a base URL. So from this point on, we can just use relative URLs. So whenever I say like just // then it means the index page, or / fetch-data, then that's that weather forecast page. So it makes our life a bit easier. So we can just make that one look like that. So that's a bit nicer. Now, after loading that page, we actually have to make a request to Azure AD. So now this request is actually going to be run by the Cypress process. So this is not an Ajax request, which is important because the Ajax request for this would actually get blocked. So we're going to use the authority, which is login.microsoftonline.com/your tenant ID. And then we're going to add a little bit to the end to build the V2 token endpoint. That's the URL we're going to call. We're going to make a post request. And in the body, we'll have some data. And that data is going to be some form data. So the first thing that we're going to tell Azure AD is that this is a password grant type. So ROPC flow, resource owner, password credentials. to specify the client ID, the client secret. We're going to specify the username, which we could just shorten like that, but for clarity, I will leave it like this. And then we do need to specify the scope parameter. Now, the scope parameter is, of course, special because it defines what kind of tokens we actually want. And so we do need an ID token as well as an access token. So to get the ID token, you actually have to specify the OpenID and profile scopes. And then we add to that the API scopes. And then we actually construct a single string out of them, which we join with spaces. So it's a space delimited string. Okay, so now we've actually done our authentication request here. And then we just add another handler there where we take the response from Azure AD and call a function which we haven't defined yet called inject tokens. And we just pass in the response body. Then finally, once we have actually injected the tokens into local storage, we can reload the page. So MSL.js doesn't know that we've actually added the tokens to local storage. So we just reload the page, so that then it figures out, okay, yeah, the tokens are there. And yes, okay, the user is already authenticated, right? So the next thing to do, I think, would be to define that inject tokens function, which takes the response body, which we are going to call token response. And first things first, we're going to decode the returned ID token. So we need a decode function, and the first option here is to auto import. So we'll do that. And we will give it the token response.id token. So in this case, the ID token is in the response body in the JSON as an ID underscore token property. And now we're going to need to construct some variables that we're going to be using a lot. And so one of them actually is the, hang on a moment if I can just find one. One of them is the local account ID. And the other one is the home account ID. So the home account ID actually just is here, this kind of tenant ID dot a kind of user ID. Formatting for that. So first we're going to take the local account ID, and for that we're going to use the OID claim from the ID token. Or in case that's not available, we will use the SID claim. Now, this is something that I can't exactly verify. I've never received a token that didn't have an OID claim, actually. So that's a case that hasn't happened yet, but this is how it is in the MSL.js source code. So that's how I've decided to implement it here, just to maximize the compatibility. And then we need something that they call a realm. But that's going to be the TID claim in the ID token. So that's the tenant ID, but they call it a realm here. So then we will construct the home account ID as it is constructed in the MSL.js source code. And take the local account ID and add the realm at the end. So actually, I think I said it the wrong way around. So the local account ID is first and then the tenant ID. Then we'll grab the username from the ID token. That's in a claim called preferred underscore username. And then we'll grab their display name as well from there. So that's in the claim called name. Okay. Now we actually have basically all of the information that we need to construct all of those JSON objects that are stored in local storage. So for that, we actually need to construct this key, which has a specific format for each of these entities. And then we need to construct those values. So first of all, we can construct the account entity. It has a key that has the home account ID dash the environment, which was the login windows.net, and then it ends in the realm. So naming these exactly is pretty important so that MSL.js is actually going to find them and match them properly. So it knows that, okay, yeah, this is one of these entities. And then we're going to call a function which we don't have yet, called build account entity. And we're going to pass in the home account ID, the realm, the local account ID, the username, and the display name. Those are all the values that it needs. Now, because watching me type out these things is a little bit boring, I think, I'm going to actually add the rest of them here. Now, the important thing to notice here is that the keys change slightly. So there's an ID token entity that has the word ID token in the name, and then there's access token entities that have the word access token in them. Also note the additional dash at the end of the ID token key. It's a little bit weird, but okay, yeah, that's how MSL.js specified it. Then here in the API, in the access token entity, you actually do need those scopes in the key. And once we have all of those, so now we have the keys and we also have those JavaScript objects that we have. We can actually just write them to local storage. So we can call local storage set item, account key, and JSON stringify account entity. And then we just, repeat that for all of them. Okay, that's actually the wrong one. I suppose the order doesn't really matter. Okay, so now we've actually written them into local storage by doing that. Now we do need those functions that actually build them. Now, I'm also going to copy paste these because I think these are also going to be a little bit boring to watch me write. But I'll still walk through them a bit. So the account entity is relatively simple. It just adds those values that were there that we gave it. And we leave this client info property empty. So there is an actual value in that if we take a look at the browser. So that's this one. So that's this kind of a base64 encoded object here. So it's a really, really simple object actually, but you do need to do a little bit of fancy URL safe base64 encoding to create it. And honestly, I just felt like it just made the example a lot more complicated than it needs to be. And this value really doesn't even seem to get used at all, at least in these tests. So we can just leave it out. The ID token entity is really, really simple. It just has credential type ID token in there. And the access token entity is pretty simple, but it also has these expiry times that we have to calculate there. Well, I suppose you don't have to calculate them, but I've decided to just do it kind of correctly. So they are actually the correct values that they should be. And this was an interesting thing that I hit during testing, and this honestly cost at least an hour of work, is that you actually do need to put the scopes in lowercase in here. Otherwise, it's not going to find this entity and it all fails. So there's some stupidity there. I suppose it's just to normalize it. Okay, we actually have all of the functions there now to actually inject it. And so the login function essentially should work now. I'm just going to check if there was any questions in the chat. No, good. So now we can go back to the test. And now instead of visiting this page, we can actually just call login. And then we could actually just say visit fetch data. So go to that page. Let me just check that the URL is correct. Yes, it is. So login and then visit this page. I'm actually going to change that to the ES6 style because I prefer that, and VS Code is complaining about that. So let's try this. Let's see what happens. So if everything goes correctly, it should open first the page and it'll show you the login button. And then it'll acquire the tokens, it'll inject the tokens into local storage and then reload the page. So let's see what happens. So you can see the request going out. Takes a moment. Then we are reloading. And we are successful. So we are actually we can actually see that that table is visible. We are logged in. So from the point of view of our single page app, for all intents and purposes, we are logged in, as well as from the point of view of the app, from the API, because the API did actually return data to us, even though it requires authentication. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now we can make this a little bit cooler, in my opinion, by adding a Cypress command, actually, for the login. So there's actually an example of this here in the commands JS file that it gives you. So we can add the login command that just returns login, which we import from the auth.js module. Now, and we do have to actually return the result to allow for kind of proper chaining, I think, in there. Not totally sure of that. Cypress seems to do some fancy things with the chains. But anyway, what that actually makes possible is that we can use cy.login instead of that module. So now we can remove that reference entirely. So we just tell Cypress, please log in, then go to this page, and then run the test. And we can actually add a second test as well. For example, test that it renders 5 items in the table. So we can actually just do another Cypress get, which we will write it out in a bit. Actually, we do have to get the table. Then from there, we would like to find the rows, and those rows should have length 5. So what do we enter here? Well, it's data CY, and then we can check from here what it was. It's forecast row. So we want to match those. And there's our test. So the nice thing is that while you're running Cypress, it'll actually automatically run your tests again if you update them. So it allows you to iterate. And you can actually see that the second test was successful as well. So we can actually see the procedure here. So it visited this, did the request, reload, visit the fetch data page, get the table, find the rows, and assert that there's 5 of them. Okay, so we're pretty much done right now. So now we are actually able to write tests and run them. Now, this approach is not perfect by any means. And I think one of the big downsides of this is that it's actually running that login request on every single test, which isn't really good for performance. You could make your tests run a lot faster by caching those tokens somehow, and then only getting new tokens if they're needed, which the tokens are valid for 1 hour. So unless your tests take over 1 hour, you probably don't even need. So that is one thing that definitely could use some improvement. And Pasi has a question. Has the AAD endpoint response structure been stable in the recent years, or is there somewhat of a risk that it would cause any of these tests to fail? Yeah, so that's a really good question. Now, yes, the answer is yes, it is extremely stable. The only difference is between the version 1 and the V2 endpoint, which we're using here. So we're using the V2 endpoint. You can trust that that token response schema is stable. I think the main one that you should be concerned for stability here is the MC. Push an update out, and it figures that every user of the app is now not logged in. It's not a great thing for a big app with like thousands of users who would get like just logged out, just boom. It wouldn't be very fantastic. So with major versions of MSAL.js, there will be changes potentially, but yeah. Yeah, Pasi, it would kill quite a lot of apps if they changed the token response, like including Windows. So no. Okay, yeah. So just keep the questions coming. So we do have a couple slides to go still. So I have the Q&A section kind of here. I'm actually going to, just a moment, I'm going to copy that link and I'm going to actually post it in the chat so that you are actually able to check that out. So this is kind of the portion where I intended to have the Q&A, but I think you can just post your questions and I'm just going to go through the rest of these things in the meanwhile. So if you didn't check out Microsoft Ignite, it was an event last week where they presented a lot of new things in Microsoft Azure and Windows and Microsoft 365 and so on. So there's a YouTube playlist for some of the videos. I think there was like 16 videos today, so it's not all of them. Some more can be found in the My Ignite page, where you can see at least the pre-recorded sessions and so on already. But they're all going to show up on YouTube eventually. And another thing is that if you're interested, you can join the Microsoft Source newsletter. So this is a once a month newsletter that contains like a developer news from the community, kind of blog articles and updates to technologies and so on. So the QR code on the right just takes you to the link over there. If you're interested, you can join that. Okay, so that's actually the end of the presentation. So if you do have more questions, please do ask them. And yeah, I mean, feel free to @ me on Twitter or anything if you have some questions. I'm actually just going to post all of these links over there. Whoops, I wasn't actually supposed to open that. But yeah, if you want to check it out, then you can. So the newsletter sign up is pretty simple. Just give your first name and email and your country, and that's kind of it. And they show an example of what that newsletter looks like over there. So things like events and new learning modules and stuff like that. Okay, but hey, yeah. I mean, if you have any questions, then you can just contact me on Twitter, for example. I think that's it for the presentation today.
All right. Thank you, Joonas.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.